Chapter 17, Part 7 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 17, Part 7. The Conquest of Syria. It might seem that the course plainly marked out for the victor of Issus was to pursue and overwhelm Darius before he should have time to collect another army, and this is what Darius himself would have done if he had been Alexander. But it would have been a strategical error to plunge into the heart of the Persian Empire, leaving Syria and Egypt unsubdued behind him and a Persian fleet controlling the coast. The victory of Issus did not seduce Alexander into swerving from his inevitable course. The strategic value of that victory was simply that it opened the gates to Syria and Egypt. As the subjugation of Asia Minor was the strategic condition of subjugating Syria and Egypt, so the conquest of Syria and Egypt was the strategic condition of conquering Mesopotamia and Iran. It was the more imperative to follow this logical course of conquest, since Phoenicia supplied the main part of the hostile navy, and nothing but the reduction of the Phoenician towns would effectually break down the sea power of Persia. No one could swoop more swiftly than Alexander when it was the hour to swoop, but never did he display his superior command of the art of war more signally than when he let the royal prey escape him and quietly carried out the plan of conquest which he had predestined. The Persian kings had allowed the Phoenician traders to go on their own way, and meddled little with their prosperous cities so long as the Phoenician navy was at their disposal of Persia. If these strong and wealthy semi-insular cities of the coast, cut off as they were from the inner country by the high range of Lebanon, had formed a solid federal union, they might have easily succeeded in winning complete independence in the days of Persian decadence. But though Tyre, Sidon, and Aradus were bound together by a federal bond, their commercial interests clashed, and their jealousies prevented a hearty national effort. This had been illustrated by a recent experience. When Sidon had revolted from Persia in the reign of Artaxerxes Ochus, her two sister cities promised at a federal meeting to stand by her. But both Tyre and Aradus selfishly calculated that if Sidon were crushed and punished, her trade would come to themselves, and they left her to maintain the struggle alone. She succumbed to the power of Ochus, her town was burnt down, and she lost her rights as a city. The divisions which prevented the Phoenicians from becoming a nation were profitable to Alexander. If their united fleet, which was now acting ineffectually in Aegean waters, had acted energetically in defense of their own coast against the Macedonian, their cities would have been impregnable even to Alexander. But those cities could not trust each other. Byblos, which in some measure had taken the place of Sidon, and Aradus sent their submission to the conqueror of Issus, while dismantled Sidon, which still contributed some ships to the fleet, hoped to be reinstated in her old position by the favor of Persia's foe. Her hope was not disappointed. Alexander restored Sidon to her constitution and her territory. It cannot have been long after this that a kingling of Sidon was laid in a resting place worthy of the great conqueror himself. His sculptured sarcophagus, recently dug up in a burying ground in the Sidonian kings, is one of the most beautiful achievements of Greek art. But we may well associate this monument with Alexander rather than the obscure Phoenician for whose ashes it was made. For in two of the vivid scenes which are represented in colored relief upon its sides, Alexander appears on horseback. One of these is a passage from the battle of Issus. There is a melee in the center. The king charges on this side, a general, perhaps Parmenio, on that. The other scene is a lion hunt, and here, if Alexander were not marked out by the royal fillet, we might almost recognize him by his eager, straining face. Alexander advanced southwards towards Tyre. Ambassadors from this city met him on the road, professing the readiness of the Tyrians to do his will. Alexander expressed his intention of visiting the city in order to sacrifice in the famous temple of Heracles, but a Macedonian visit was far from the wish of the men of Tyre. Persia was not yet subdued, and their policy was to await the event, and avoid compromising themselves by a premature adhesion to Macedonia. They felt secure on their island rock, which was protected by 80 ships, apart from the squadron which was absent in the Aegean. Accordingly, they invited Alexander to sacrifice in Old Tyre, on the mainland, but refused to receive either Persian or Macedonian into the city. To subdue Tyre was an absolute necessity, as Alexander explained to a council of his generals and captains, which he called together. It was not safe to advance to Egypt, or to pursue Darius, while the Persians were lords of the sea, and the only way of wresting their sea power from them was to capture Tyre, the most important naval station on the coast. Once Tyre fell, the Phoenician fleet, which was the most numerous and strongest part of the Persian navy, would come over to Macedon, for the rowers would not row, or the men fight when they had no habitations to row or fight for. The reduction of Cyprus and Egypt would then follow without trouble. Alexander grasped and never let go the fact that Tyre was the key to the whole situation. It was easy to say that Tyre must be captured, but it was not easy to say how, without a powerful navy, its capture could be achieved. This was perhaps the hardest military task that Alexander's genius ever encountered. The city, girt by walls of great height and magnificently strong masonry, stood on an island severed from the continent by a sound of more than half a mile in width. On the face which faced the mainland were the two harbors, the northern or Sidonian harbor with a narrow mouth, and the southern or Egyptian. It might seem utterly hopeless for an enemy vastly inferior at sea to attempt a siege of the island rock. And in truth there was only one way for a land power to set about the task. Those 1,000 yards of water must be bridged over, and the isle annexed to the mainland. Without hesitation Alexander began the building of the causeway. The first part of the work was easy, for the water was shallow, but when the mole approached the island, the strait deepened, and the workmen came within range of the walls, and the difficulties of the task began. Triremes issued from the havens on either side to shoot missiles at the men who were at work. To protect them Alexander erected 2 towers on the causeway, and mounted engines on the towers to reply to the missiles from the galleys. He attached to those wooden towers curtains of leather, to screen both towers and workmen from the projectiles which were hurled from the city walls. But the men of Tyre were ingenious. They constructed a fire ship filled with dry wood and inflammables, and choosing a day on which a favorable wind blew, they towed it close to the dam and set it on fire. The device succeeded. The burning vessel soon wrapped the towers and all the engines in flames, and the triremes which had towed it up discharged showers of darts at the Macedonians who attempted to extinguish the fire. The Tyrians too rowed across from their island in boats, and tore up the stakes at the unfinished part of the mole. Undismayed by this disaster, which seemed to show the hopelessness of the enterprise, Alexander only went to work more vigorously. It was necessary to take Tyre, and he was determined that Tyre should be taken. He widened the causeway throughout its whole length, so that it could accommodate more towers and engines before he attempted to complete it. He saw that it would be needful to support his operations from the causeway by operations from shipboard, and he went to Sidon to bring up a few galleys which were stationed there. But at this moment the aspect of affairs was suddenly changed by the accession to Alexander of naval forces which enabled him to cope with Tyre at an advantage on her own element. The squadrons of Aridus and Bibulus, which were acting in the Aegean, learning that their cities had submitted to Alexander, left the fleet and sailed to Sidon, which the Macedonians had chosen as their naval station. These Phoenician ships were about 80, and at the same time there came 9 galleys from Rhodes, and 10 from Lycia and Cilicia. The adhesion of the kings of Cyprus presently followed, and reinforced the fleet at Sidon by 120 ships. With a fleet of about 250 triremes at his command, Alexander was now far stronger at sea than the merchants of Tyre, and though the siege of the mighty stronghold was still a formidable task, it was no longer superhuman. While the fleet was being made ready in the roads of Sidon, and the engineers were fabricating new siege engines to batter down the walls of Tyre, Alexander made an expedition at the head of his light troops to punish the native brigands who infested the hills of Anti-Lebanon, and made the traffic between the coast and the hinterland unsafe. Perhaps it was now that he received an embassy from the great king. offering an immense ransom for the captives of the royal house, and the surrender of all the lands west of the Euphrates, proposing that Alexander should marry the daughter of Darius and become his ally. The message was discussed in a council, and Parmenio said that if he were Alexander he would accept the terms. "And I," said the king, "would accept them if I were Parmenio." Alexander was resolved to carry out his plan of conquest to the end. He would agree to no compromise. He bade the ambassadors say that he would receive neither money nor provinces in lieu of the whole empire of Darius, for that all the land and possessions of Darius were his. He would marry the daughter of Darius if he chose, whether Darius willed it or not, and if Darius wished for any boon he must come himself and ask for it. From Sidon Alexander bore down upon Tyre with his own fleet, hoping to entice the Tyrians into an engagement. He commanded the right wing, while the left was committed to the charge of Craterus and Pyntagoras, the king of Cypriot Salamis. When this fleet hove in sight, the men of Tyre were astonished and dismayed. Before, they would have gladly given battle, but they saw that they had no chance against so many, and they drew up their triremes in close array to block the mouths of their harbors. Alexander set the Cyprian vessels on the north side of the mole to blockade the Sidonian harbor, and the Phoenician on the south side to blockade the Egyptian harbor. It was opposite this harbor on the mainland that his own pavilion was placed. The mole had now been carried up to the island, and engineers, the best that Phoenicia and Cyprus could furnish, had prepared the engines of war. All was ready for a grand attack on the eastern wall. Some of the engines were placed on the mole, others on transport ships or superannuated galleys. But little impression was made on the wall, which on this side was 150 feet high and enormously thick, and the besieged replied to the attack with volleys of fiery missiles from powerful engines which were mounted on their lofty battlements. Moreover, the machine-bearing vessels could not come close enough to the walls for effective action. Huge stones lying under the water hindered their approach. Alexander decided that these must at all costs be removed, and galleys with windlasses were anchored at the spot in order to drag the boulders away. It was a slow task, and was thwarted by the Tyrians. Covered vessels shot out of the havens and cut the anchor ropes of the galleys, so that they drifted away. Alexander tried to meet this by placing boats similarly decked close to the anchors, but even this failed, since Tyrian divers swam under water and cut the cables. The only resource was to attach the anchors with chains instead of ropes, and by this means the stones were hauled away and the ships could approach the wall. The Tyrians now resorted to a last device. They spread the sails of all the ships which were riding at the entrance of the northern harbor, and behind this curtain of canvas which screened them from the observation of the enemy, they manned 7 triremes, 3 5-oared and 3 4-oared boats, with the coolest and bravest of their seamen, and waiting for the hour of noon, when the sailors of the besieging vessels used generally to disembark, and Alexander himself used to retire to his tent, they rowed noiselessly toward the Scythian squadron, which was taken completely by surprise, sank some of the vessels at once, and drove the rest on the strand. It happened that on this day Alexander remained for a shorter time than usual in his pavilion, and when he returned to his station with the Phoenician ships on the south side of the mole, discovering what had happened, he stationed the main part of those ships close to the Egyptian harbor to prevent the enemy from making any movement on his side, and taking with him some 5-oared boats and 5 swift-sailing galleys, sailed around the island. The men in the city saw Alexander and all that he did, and signaled to their own vessels who were engaged in battering the stranded Cyprian vessels. But the signals were not seen or heard until Alexander was close upon them. When they saw him coming, they desisted from their work and made all speed for the haven, but the greater number of their boats were disabled by Alexander's vessels before they reached the harbor mouth. Henceforward the ships of Tyre lay useless in the harbors, unable to do anything for the defense of the island. It was now a struggle between the engineers of Tyre and the engineers of Alexander. The wall opposite to the mole defied all machines of battery and methods of assault, and the northern part of the same eastern wall, though the big stones had been cleared away from the water below it, proved equally impracticable. Accordingly, the efforts of the besiegers were united upon the south wall near the Egyptian harbor. Here at length a bit of the wall was torn down, and there was fighting in the breach, but the Tyrians easily repelled the attack. It was an encouragement for Alexander. It showed him the weak spot, and 2 days later he prepared a grand and supreme assault. The vessels with the siege engines were set to work at the southern wall, while 2 triremes waited hard by, one filled with Hypaspes under Admetus, the other with a phalanx regiment ready as soon as the wall yielded to hurl their crews into the breach. Ships were stationed in front of the 2 havens to force their way in at a favorable moment, and the rest of the fleet, manned with light troops and furnished with engines, were disposed at various points round the island to embarrass and bewilder the besieged and hinder them from concentrating at the main point of attack. A wide breach was made. 2 triremes were rowed up to the spot. The bridges were lowered, and the Hypaspes, Admetus at their head, first mounted the wall. Admetus was pierced with a lance, but Alexander took his place and drove back the Tyrians from the breach. Tower after tower was captured. Soon all the southern wall was in the hands of the Macedonians, and Alexander was able to make his way along the battlements to the royal palace, which was the best base for attacking the city. But the city had already been entered from other points. The chains of both the Sidonian and the Egyptian harbors had been burst by the Cyprian and Phoenician squadrons. The Tyrian ships had been disabled, and the troops had pressed into the town. The inhabitants made their last stand in a place called the Agean. 8,000 are said to have been slain, and the rest of the people, about 30,000, were sold into slavery, with the exception of the king, as Emilco, and a few other men of high position who were set at liberty. The siege had been long and wearisome, but the time and the labor were not too dear a price. The fall of Tyre gave Alexander Syria and Egypt, and the naval superiority in the eastern half of the Mediterranean. He performed the sacrifice of Heracles in the temple to which the Tyrians had refused him access, and celebrated the solemnity with a torch procession and games. The communities of Syria and Palestine that had not submitted, like Damascus after the victory of Issus, submitted now after the capture of Tyre, and he encountered no resistance in his southern march to Egypt, until he came to the great frontier stronghold Gaza, the city of the Philistines. Girt with a stout wall, Gaza stood on a high rising ground, and more than 2 miles of sand lie between the city and the seashore, so that a fleet was no hope to a besieger. The place had been committed by Darius to the care of Battus, a trusty eunuch, who had been well furnished with provisions for a long siege. Battus refused to surrender, trusting in the strength of the fortifications, and at the first sight the engineers of Alexander declared that the wall could never be stormed on account of the height of the hill on which it stood. But Alexander was now accustomed to overcome the insuperable, and the conqueror who had sacked Tyre was not ready to turn away from the walls of Gaza. He could not leave such an important post on the line from Damascus to Egypt in the hands of the enemy. He ordered ramparts to be thrown up round the city, in order that the siege engines mounted on this elevation might be on a level with the wall. The best chance seemed to be on the south side, and here the work was pushing on rapidly. When the engines were placed in position, Alexander offered a sacrifice, and a bird of prey flying over the altar dropped a stone on the king's garlanded head. The soothsayer interpreted the meaning of this sign. "O king, you will take the city, but you must take good heed for your own safety on this day." Alexander was cautious for a while, but when the besieged sallied forth from the gates and attacked the Macedonians who were working the engines on the ramparts, and pressed them hard, he rushed to their aid, and was wounded in the shoulder by a dart from a catapult. Thus part of the sign had come true. The other part was in time fulfilled. The engines which had been used in the siege of Tyre arrived by sea. The rampart was widened and raised to a greater height, and underground mines were dug beneath the walls. The walls yielded in many places to the mines and the engines, but it was not till the 4th attack that the Macedonians succeeded in scaling the breaches and entering the city. The slaughter was greater than in Tyre. The women and children were sold into bondage, and the place became a Macedonian fortress. End of chapter 17, part 7. Chapter 17, parts 8 and 9 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 17, Parts 8 and 9. Section 8. Conquest of Egypt. Egypt was now absolutely cut off from Persia. The gate to that sequestered land was open, and Alexander had only to march in. The Egyptians had not the vigor to offer any national resistance to the Greek invader, and Mazaches, the Persian satrap, seeing Phoenicia and Syria in Alexander's power, the Macedonian navy in the roadstead of Pelusium, and no help at hand, thought only of making his submission and winning the conqueror's grace. Sending his fleet up the Pelusic branch of the Nile to meet him at Memphis, Alexander journeyed thither by way of Heliopolis. In the capital of the Pharaohs, where he was probably proclaimed king, he sacrificed to Apis and the other native gods, and thereby won the goodwill of the people, who contrasted his piety with the bigotry of the Persian monarch Ochus, who had killed the sacred bull. But while the new king showed that he would treat the native religion and customs with respect, he also made it clear that Greek civilization was now to pour into the exclusive regions of the Nile. He held athletic games and a poetical contest at Memphis, and the most famous artists from Greece came to take part in it. From Memphis he sailed down the river to Canopus, and took a step which, if he had never performed any other exploit in his life, would have made his name memorable forever. He chose the ground east of Rhyochus, between Lake Mareotis and the sea, as the site of a new city, over against the island of Pharos, famous in Homeric song, and soon to become more famous still as the place of the first lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world. The king is said to have himself traced out the ground plan of Alexandria, the marketplace and the circuit of the walls, the sanctuary of Isis, and the temples of the Hellenic gods. He joined the mainland with the island by a causeway of 7 stades, nearly a mile in length, and thus formed 2 harbors. The subsequent history of Alexandria, which has held its position as a port for more than 2,000 years, proves that its founder had a true eye in choosing the place of the most famous of his new cities. The greatness of the place as a mart of the world far surpassed any purposes or hopes that Alexander could have formed, but his object in founding it could hardly be doubted. Alexandria was not intended to supersede Memphis as the capital of Egypt. It was intended to take the place of Tyre as the commercial center of Western Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean. And there was a good reason for diverting the lines of traffic from the Phoenician to the Egyptian coast, for it was naturally the policy of Alexander to transfer the trade of the world so far as might be into the hands of Greeks, but any new emporium rising on the ruins of Tyre or Sidon would have soon become predominantly Phoenician, owing to the Phoenician genius for trade, whereas on the Egyptian coast Greek traders would encounter no such rivalry. It was thus with a view to the commercial interests of his own race that Alexander founded the port of Egypt. In the official style of the Egyptian monarchy, the pharaohs were the sons of Ammon, and as the successor of the pharaohs, Alexander assumed the same title. It was therefore necessary, in order to regulate his position, that an official assurance should be given by Ammon himself that Alexander was his son. To obtain such a declaration, and satisfy fully the formalities required by the priests, Alexander undertook a journey to the oracular sanctuary of Ammon in the oasis of Siwa. And this motive is alone sufficient to explain the expedition. But it may well be that in Alexander's mind there was a vague notion that there was something divine about his own origin, something mystical in his mother's conception, and that, like Achilles, he was somewhat more than an ordinary man. Proceeding along the coast to Paraetonion, he was there met by envoys who conveyed the submission of Cyrene. By this acquisition the western frontier of the Macedonian empire extended to the border of the Carthaginian sphere of influence. Alexander then struck across the desert to visit that Egyptian temple which was most famous in the Greek world, the temple, as it was always called, of Zeus Ammon. There were no tracks to guide the travelers, for the south wind had plowed up the sand and obliterated the road marks, and stories were told in the camp of miraculous guidance vouchsafed to the favorite of the god. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, who was destined hereafter to rule over Egypt and Libya, recorded in his memoirs that two snakes moved in front of the troops and showed the way, while Aristobulus, another companion of the king, spoke of the guidance of two crows. A certain mystery enveloped this expedition. It is said that Alexander told no man what he asked the god, or what the god replied, save only that the answer pleased him. But it is certain that the priests had made some dispositions that Ammon spoke and recognized him as his son. The very route by which Alexander returned to Memphis is uncertain, for the same two companions differ, Ptolemy stating that he fared direct across the desert, and Aristobulus that he returned by Parætonion. At Memphis he organized the government of Egypt, entrusting it to two native nomarchs, and appointing separate Greek governors for the adjoining districts of Arabia and for Libya. But the control of the finances was placed in the hands of a special minister, Cleomenes of Naucratis. Several military commanders were also appointed, and it would seem that Alexander instituted this divided command as a safeguard against the danger of a rebellion. For, geographically situated as Egypt was, an ambitious commander might have a fair prospect of holding the country against his lord, and its recent history as a Persian province had illustrated the difficulty of dealing with it. If this be so, Alexander inaugurated a policy which was followed in later days and in another form by his Roman successors. Section 9. Battle of Gaugamela and the conquest of Babylonia. The new lord of Egypt and Syria returned with the spring to Tyre. The whole coastland was now in his possession, and he controlled the sea. The time had come to advance into the heart of the Persian Empire. Having spent some months in the Phoenician city, busied with various matters of policy and administration, as well as with the plans for his next campaign, he set forth at the head of 40,000 infantry and 7,000 horse, and reached Thapsacus on the Euphrates at the beginning of August. The building of 2 bridges had already begun, but the Persian Mazaeus, who was stationed with troops on the further shore, had hindered their completion. When Alexander arrived, he withdrew. The bridges were finished, and the army passed over. The objective of Alexander was Babylon. At that time of year it would have been mad to follow the direct route down the Euphrates which was traversed by Cyrus and the 10,000. Alexander chose the other road, across the north of Mesopotamia, and down the Tigris on its eastern bank. Throughout the Asiatic campaigns of Alexander we are struck by the perfect organization of his transports and supplies, but we are struck even more by the certainty of his movements through strange lands, as if he had a map of the country before him. His intelligence department must have been excellent, and though our records give us no intimations on the subject, it has been supposed with much plausibility that here the invader received help from the Jews, who, ever since the captivity, were scattered across Media and Babylonia. It is certain that Alexander had shown special favor to the race of Israel at the foundation of Egyptian Alexandria. He had invited a Jewish colony to settle there, enjoying the rights of citizens and yet living in a separate quarter and keeping their own national customs. From some Persian scouts who were captured, it was ascertained that Darius, with a yet larger multitude than that which had succumbed at Issus, was on the other side of the river, determined to contest the passage. Alexander crossed the Tigris, not at Nineveh, the usual place of crossing, but higher up at Bezabde. On the same night the moon went into eclipse, and men anxiously sought in the phenomena a portent of the issue of the coming struggle for the lordship of Asia. Marching southward for some days, Alexander learned that Darius was encamped in a plain near Gaugamela, on the river Bumodus. The numbers of the army were reported at 1,000,000 foot and 40,000 horse. Having given his men 4 days' rest, Alexander moved on by night and halted on a hill looking down on the plain where the enemy lay prepared for battle. A council of war was held, and the question was discussed whether the attack should be made immediately. But Parmenio counseled a day's delay, for the purpose of reconnoitring fully the enemy's position, and discovering whether perchance covered pits had been dug or stakes laid in the ground. Parmenio's counsel was followed, and the troops pitched their camp in the order in which they were to fight. Alexander rode over the plain, and found that the Persians had cleared it of all bushes and obstacles which might impede the movements of their cavalry or the effect of their scythed chariots. The following night was spent by the Persians under arms, for their camp was unfortified, and they feared a night attack. And a night attack was recommended by Parmenio. But Alexander preferred to trust the issue to his own generalship and the superior discipline of his troops, and not to brave the hazards of a struggle in the dark. He said to Parmenio, "I do not steal victory." And under the gallantry of this reply he concealed in his usual manner the prudence and policy of his resolve. A victory over the Persian host, won in the open field in the light of day, would have a far greater effect in establishing his prestige in Asia than an advantage stolen by night. The great king, according to his wont, was in the centre of the Persian array, surrounded by his kinsfolk and his Persian bodyguard. On either side of them were Greek mercenaries, Indian auxiliaries with a few elephants, and Carians whose ancestors had been settled in Upper Asia. The centre was strengthened and deepened by a second line, composed of the Babylonian troops and the men from the shores of the Persian Gulf, and the Uxians, who dwelt east of Susa, and the Sitakenes. On the left wing, the Cadusians from the shore of the Caspian, and the men of Susa were nearest the centre. Next came a mixed host of Persian horse and foot, and at the extreme left were the troops from the far east, from Arachosia and Bactria. This wing was covered by 1,000 Bactrian cavalry, 100 Scyth-armed chariots, and the Scythian cavalry from the desert districts of Lake Aral. On the right were the contingents of the Caucasian folks, the Hyrcanians and Taurians from the southeastern shores of the Caspian, the Parthians, who were destined in the future to found a new oriental monarchy, the Sakai from the slopes of the Hindu Kush, and the Medes, and the dwellers in Mesopotamia and northern Syria. Against this host, of which the cavalry alone is said to have been as numerous as all the infantry of the enemy, Alexander descended the hill in the morning. On his left wing, commanded as usual by Parmenio, were the cavalry of the Thessalian and confederate Greeks. In the center, the 6 regiments of the phalanx, and on the right, the Hypaspes and the 8 squadrons of the companions, the royal squadron of Clytus being at the extreme right. Covering the right wing were some light troops, spear-throwers and archers. The line was far outflanked on both sides by the enemy, and the danger which Alexander had most to fear, as at the battle of Issus, was of being attacked in rear or flank. Here both wings were in peril. He sought to meet these contingencies by forming behind each wing a second line, which by facing round a quarter or half circle could meet an attack on flank or rear. Behind the left wing were placed Thracian horse and foot, some Greek confederate cavalry, and Greek mercenary cavalry. Behind the right, the old Greek mercenaries under Cleander, the Macedonian archers, and some of the Agrianian spear-throwers, the mounted pikemen, and the light Paeonian cavalry. And at the extreme right, to bear the brunt of a flank assault, the new Greek mercenaries under Menidas. As he advanced, Alexander and his right wing were opposite to the center of the enemy's line, and he was outflanked by the whole length of the enemy's left. He therefore bore obliquely to the right, and even when the Scythian horsemen riding forward came into contact with his own light troops, he continued to move his squadrons of heavy cavalry in the same direction. Darius saw with anxiety that this movement would soon bring the Macedonian right outside the ground which he had carefully leveled and prepared for the actions of his Scyth chariots, and as he had no small part of his hopes in the deadly effect of these chariots, he commanded the Scythian and Bactrian cavalry to ride round and deliver a flank charge in order to hinder any further advance towards the right. The charge was met by the new mercenaries of Menidas, but they were too few. They were driven back until the Paeonians and the old mercenaries were bidden to come to their support. Then the barbarians gave way, but only in a short while. Reinforced by more troops, they returned to the charge. The battle raged, and it was well if the Macedonians, far outnumbered, could hold their ground. Meanwhile Darius had loosed his Scythed cars to whirl destruction into the ranks of the companions and the Hypaspes. but the archers and the Agean spear-throwers received them with showers of spears and arrows. Some of these active hillmen seized the reins of the horses and pulled the drivers from their seats, while the Hypasts, swift and undismayed, opened their ranks, and the terrible chariots rattled harmless down the intervals. The whole Persian line was now advancing to attack, and Alexander was waiting for the moment to deliver his cavalry charge. He had to send his mounted pikemen to the help of the light cavalry, who were being hard pressed on the right by the Scythians and Bactrians, and as a countercheck to this reinforcement, squadrons of Persian cavalry were dispatched to the assistance of their fellows. By the withdrawal of these squadrons a gap was caused in the left wing, and into this gap Alexander plunged at the head of his cavalry column, and split the line in two. Thus the left side of the enemy's center was exposed, and, turning obliquely, Alexander charged into its ranks. Meanwhile the bristling phalanx was moving forward, and was soon engaged in close combat with another part of the Persian center. The storm of battle burst with wildest fury round the spot where the Persian king was trembling, and what befell at Issus befell again at Gaugamela. The great king turned his chariot and fled. His Persians fled with him, and swept along in their flight the troops who had been posted in the rear. Thus the Persian center and the neighboring part of the left wing were cut down or routed by the phalanx, the Hypasts, and the companions, and in the meantime the severe struggle of the light cavalry on the uttermost left had also ended in victory for the Macedonians. The regiments of the phalanx in their rapid advance had failed to keep abreast, and it would seem that when the regiment of Craterus on the extreme left was already far forward in the thick of the fight, the regiment commanded by Simmias, second from the left, was considerably in the rear. From his position Simmias saw that the Thessalian cavalry on the left wing were pressed hard by their adversaries, and he halted his regiment, in order apparently to make a movement to assist them. But the Indian and Persian cavalry of the hostile center rushed through the gap in the phalanx, and rode straight onward to the Macedonian camp, unhindered by the rear line of the left wing, who did not expect an enemy on that side. The captives in the camp burst out and helped their friends to murder the Thracians who had been sent to guard it. The Greek mercenaries and Thracians of the rear line soon perceived what had happened. They turned round and attacked the plunderers in the rear and overcame them. Meanwhile Parmenio was hard bestead. The Mesopotamians and the Syrians on the extreme Persian right had attacked his cavalry in the flank or rear. Parmenio sped a messenger to Alexander entreating aid, and Alexander desisted from the pursuit of his fleeing rival to restore the battle on his left wing. Riding back with his companions he encountered a large body of cavalry, Persians, Parthians, and Indians in full retreat, but in orderly array. A desperate conflict ensued, perhaps the most fearful in the whole battle, the Persians fighting not for victory but for life. 60 of the companions fell, but Alexander was again victorious, and rode on to the help of Parmenio. But Parmenio no longer needed his help. Not the least achievement of this day of great deeds was the brilliant fighting of the Thessalian cavalry, who not only sustained the battle against the odds which had wrung from Parmenio the cry for aid, but in the end routed their foemen before Alexander could reach the spot. The battle was won, and the fate of the Persian Empire was decided. Alexander did not tarry on the field. He lost not a moment in resuming the chase which he had abandoned, and, riding eastward throughout the night on the tracks of the Persian king, he reached Arbela on the morrow. It befell now as it had befallen after Issus. He did not take the king, but found at Arbela his chariot, his shield, and his bow. Darius fled into the highlands of Media, and Ariobarzanes, with a host of the routed army, hastened southward to Persia. Alexander did not follow either king or satrap, but pursued his way to Babylon. It might have been expected, and Alexander seems to have expected, that the men of Babylon, entrusting in their mighty walls, would have offered to the victor of Gaugamela the same defiance which the men of Tyre offered to the victor of Issus. He was disappointed. When he approached the city with his army arrayed for action, the gates opened, and the Babylonians streamed out, led by their priests and their chief men. The satrap Mezaius, who had fought bravely in the recent battle, surrendered the city and citadel. In Babylonia, Alexander followed the same policy which he had already followed in Egypt. He appeared as the protector of the national religions which had been depressed and slighted by the fire worshippers. He rebuilt the Babylonian temples which had been destroyed, and above all he commanded the restoration of the marvellous temple of Bel, standing on its 8 towers, on which the rage of Xerxes had vented itself when he had returned from the rout of Salamis. The Persian Mazaeus, who was retained in his post as satrap of Babylonia. End of chapter 17, sections 8 and 9. Chapter 17, section 10, 11, and 12 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 17, Parts 10, 11, and 12. Section 10. Conquest of Susiana and Persis. Having rested his army in the luxurious and wonderful city of the Euphrates, the conqueror advanced southeastward to Susa, the summer residence of the Persian court. Susa had been already secured for him by Philoxenus, whom he had dispatched hither from Arbela with some light troops. In the citadel he found enormous treasures of gold and silver and purple. Among other precious things at Susa was the sculpted group of the tyrant slayers, Harmodius and Aristogiton, which Xerxes had carried off from Athens, and Alexander had the pleasure of sending back to its home this strange historical monument, now more precious than ever through its own strange history. Though it was midwinter, Alexander soon left Susa to accomplish one of the most arduous adventures that he ever undertook. He had won the treasures of Susa, but there were immense treasures still in the palaces of Cyrus and Darius in the heart of the Persian highlands, and these were guarded not only by the difficulties of the mountainous approaches, but by the army which Ariobarzanes had rescued from the overthrow of Gaugamela. Perhaps the reason for Alexander's haste in pressing on to Persis was the fear that Darius might descend with a new force from Media, if time were given him before Ariobarzanes was crushed. But whatever were his reasons, it seemed to him of the greatest moment to secure Persis immediately. His road lay southeastward, and when he had crossed the river Pasitigris, the first obstacle that he encountered was the independent tribe of the Uxian hillsmen, of whom the Persian kings themselves were accustomed to bestow gifts for their good will. The barbarians held the passes through which the road lay, but a night march by a difficult mountain path enabled Alexander to surprise them, and the Uxians henceforward were forced to pay yearly gifts to the lord of Asia, 100 horses, 500 draught oxen, and 30,000 sheep. The Macedonian army was now in the midst of a region which was unknown to Greek charts. Alexander's advance is a march not only of conquest but of discovery, and opens a new epoch in the history of geographical sciences by revealing Central Asia to the knowledge of Europe. Leaving half of his army with Parmenio to proceed more slowly along the main road, Alexander led the other half, including the Macedonians, both horse and foot, by a shorter path through the hills to the narrow defile which formed the entrance to Persis and was called the Persian Gates. Ariobarzanes was posted there with 40,000 foot and 700 horse, guarding the rocky pass which he had fortified by a wall. An attack, easily repelled, showed Alexander that the pass was unpregnable. Yet it must be carried, for this was the only road to the royal cities of Persia. For a moment Alexander was baffled. Never, perhaps, not even before Tyre, was he encountered by a problem more desperate to all seeming. But he learned from a prisoner of some extremely perilous paths leading round, through the forest which covered the mountains, to the back of the pass. At this season the snow made these paths more dangerous than ever, and they might well seem hopeless to men weighed down with heavy armor. But they were the only hope, and Alexander did not hesitate. He left Craterus with part of the troops in front of the pass, with orders to attack as soon as he heard the Macedonian trumpets sounding from above on the other side. With the rest of his force, including most of the cavalry, 3 regiments of the phalanx, the Hypaspes, and other light troops, he set forth at night, and marched quickly 11 miles along the precipitous snowy track, intersected frequently by deep gullies. When the point was reached at which he was to turn in order to descend on the Persian camp, he again divided his forces, and sent 1 division forward to bridge the river Araxes and cut off the Persian retreat. Taking the Hypaspes, the royal squadron of the companions, 1 regiment of the phalanx, and some light troops, he raced down upon the camp and destroyed or routed 3 successive sets of outposts before the day had dawned. Instead of raising the alarm, the sentinels scattered on the mountain, and when the Macedonian trumpets pealed on the brink of his entrenchments, Ariobarzanes was taken completely by surprise. Attacked on both sides, in front by Craterus, who stormed up the wall of rock, and in the rear by Alexander, the Persians were cut to pieces, or fell over precipices in their flight. Ariobarzanes with a small band escaped into the mountains. The royal palaces of Persia, to which Alexander now hurried with the utmost speed, stood in the valley of Murvdasht, fertile then, but desolate at the present day, and close to the city of Istakhr, which the Persians deemed the oldest city in the world. In Istakhr itself there was a royal house too, but the great palaces stood some miles away, close beneath the mountain, upon a lofty platform against a background of black rock. The platform was mounted by magnificent staircases, and it bore, besides massive propylaea, 4 chief buildings, the small palace of Darius, the larger palace of Xerxes, and 2 great pillared halls. The impressive ruins tell a trained eye how to reconstruct the general plan of the royal abode, and there can be no question that Achaemenian architecture had wrought here its greatest achievements, greater than the palace of Susa which Alexander had seen, greater than that of Ecbatana which he was soon to see. This cradle of the Persian kingdom, to which, city and palace together, the Greeks give the name of Persepolis, was the richest of all the cities under the sun. It is said that 120,000 talents were found in the treasury. An army of mules and camels were required to remove the spoils. This store of gold, so long withdrawn from use, was now suddenly to be restored to circulation and perturb the markets of the world. Not far off, 2 days' journey northward up the winding valley of the Murghab, was Pasargadae, the city of Cyrus. The maker of Persia built it close to the field where he had shattered the host of the Median king, and the place is still marked by his tomb and the stones of other buildings, on some of which the traveler may read the words, "I am Cyrus, the king, the Achaemenian." In Pasargadae, too, Alexander found a store of treasure. For 4 months he had made the Persian palaces his headquarters, during which time he received the submission of Carmania or Kerman, and made some excursions to punish the robbers who infested the neighboring mountains. But the most famous incident connected with the sojourn at Persepolis is the conflagration of the palace of Xerxes. The story is that, one night when Alexander and his companions were drunk deep at a royal festival, Thias, an Attic courtesan, who was of the company, mindful of her country and all the wrongs which Xerxes had wrought, flung out among the tipsy carousers the idea of burning down the house of the malignant foe who had burned the temples of Greece. The mad words of the woman inspired a wild frenzy, and whirled the revelers forth, armed with torches, to accomplish the barbarous deed. Alexander hurled the first brand, and the cedar woodwork of the palace was soon in flames. But before the fire had done its work, the king's head was cool, and he commanded the fire to be quenched. It is folly to attempt to read into this act a deliberate policy. It was the wild freak of a moment, repented the next. Section 11. Death of Darius. In the meantime, King Darius remained in Ecbatana, surrounded by the adherents who were faithful to him, chiefly the satraps of those lands which were still unconquered, Media itself and Hyrcania, Aria and Bactria, Arachosia and Drangiana. It is probable that, after the Gaugamela battle, Alexander hoped to receive some proposal from his defeated foe, more submissive and acceptable than that which had been sent after Issus. He would have been ready, perhaps, to leave to Darius the eastern part of his dominions, with the royal title, though as a dependent vassal, and to content himself for a while with the empire which he had won, including Susa and Persepolis. It may have been with the hope of receiving overtures that he tarried so long in Persis. But Darius gave no sign. Media was defensible. He had a large army from the northern satrapies, and he had Bactria as a retreat, if retreat he must. The spring was advanced when Alexander left Persis for Ecbatana. The direct road did not lie by Susa, but much further east through the land of Paratachini. He made all speed, when the news reached him by the way that Darius was at Ecbatana with a large army, prepared to fight. But when, after a succession of forced marches, he drew nigh to the city, he found that Darius had flown eastward, following the women and heavy baggage which had been sent on to the Caspian gates, and taking the treasures with him. It is said that the reason of this retreat was the default of some Cadusian and Scythian troops which had failed to arrive in time. When he reached the Median capital, Alexander was detained by the need of arranging certain matters before he pursued his rival into the northern wilds. He paid off the Thessalian troops and the other Greek confederates, giving them a handsome donative and a conduct to the Aegean. But any who chose to enroll themselves anew in his service and share in his further course of conquest might stay, and not a few stayed. Parmenio was entrusted with the care of seeing that the treasures of Persis were transported and safely deposited in the strong keep of Ecbatana, where they were to remain in charge of the treasurer Harpalus and a large body of Macedonian troops. Parmenio was then to proceed northward to Cadusia and along the shores of the Caspian Sea, where he was to meet the king. With the main part of the army Alexander hurried on, merciless to men and steeds, bent on the capture of Darius. His way lay by Rhegai, and when he reached that place, a little to the south of the modern capital of Persia, he found that the fugitive was already well beyond the Caspian gates, which lie a long day's journey to the east. Despairing of overtaking him, Alexander rested some days at Rhegai, before he advanced towards Parthia through the Caspian Pass. But meanwhile doom was stealing upon Darius by another way. His followers were beginning to suspect that ill luck dogged him, and when he proposed to stay and risk another battle, instead of continuing his retreat to Bactria, none were willing except the remnant of Greek mercenaries who were still faithful to the man who had hired them, and perhaps dreaded punishment as recusants to the Greek cause. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, was a kinsman of the king, and it was felt by many that he might be able to raise up again the Achaemenian house, which Darius had been unable to sustain. A plot was formed. Darius was seized and bound in the middle of the night, set in a litter, and hurried on as a prisoner along the road to Bactria. This event disbanded his army. The Greek mercenaries went off northwards into the Caspian mountains, and many of the Persians turned back to find pardon and grace with Alexander. They found him encamped on the Parthian side of the Caspian gates, and told him the new turn of events. When he had learned that his old rival was a prisoner, and that Bessus was now his antagonist, Alexander resolved on a swift and hot pursuit. Leaving the main body of the army to come slowly after, he set forth at once with his cavalry and some light foot, and sped the whole night through, not resting till the next day at noon, and then another evening and night at the same breathless speed. Sunrise saw him at Thara. It was the place where the great king had been put in chains, and it was ascertained from his interpreter, who had remained behind ill, that Bessus and his followers intended to surrender Darius if the pursuit were pressed. There was the greater need for haste. The pursuers rode on throughout another night. Men and horses were dropping with fatigue. At noon they came to a village where the pursuit had halted the day before, and Alexander learnt that they intended to march in the night. He asked the people if there was no short way, and was told that there was a short way, but it was waterless. Alexander instantly dismounted 500 of his horsemen, and gave their steeds to the officers and the strongest men of the infantry who were with them. With these he started in the morning, and having ridden some 45 miles, came up with the enemy at break of day. The barbarians were straggling, many of them unarmed. A few who made a stand were swept away, but most of them fled when they saw that it was Alexander. Bessus and his fellow conspirators bade their prisoner, no longer seemingly in chains, mount a horse, and when Darius refused, they stabbed him and rode their ways, wounding the litter mules too, and killing the drivers. The beasts, sore and thirsty, strayed about half a mile from the road down a side valley, where they were found at a spring by a Macedonian who came to slake his thirst. The great king was near his last gasp. If he could have spoken Greek, or if the stranger had understood Persian, he might have found words to send a message of thanks to his conqueror for the generous treatment of his wife and mother, who were then assuredly in his thoughts. Afterwards men had no scruple in placing appropriate words in the mouth of the dying monarch. It is enough to believe that he had solace of a cup of water in his supreme moments, and thanked the Macedonian soldier by a sign. Alexander viewed the body, and was said to have thrown his own cloak over it in pity. It was part of his fair luck that he had found Darius dead, for if he had taken him alive he would not have put him to death, and such a captive would have been a perpetual embarrassment. He sent the corpse with all honor to the queen mother, the last of the Achaemenian kings, buried with his forefathers at Persepolis. Section 12. Spirit of Alexander's policy as Lord of Asia. Before we follow Alexander on his marches of conquest and discovery into the regions which were then in European eyes the Far East, we may pause to observe his attitudes as ruler and king. For the months which passed between the battle of Gaugamela and the death of Darius were a critical period, which witnessed a remarkable change in his conception of his duty and in his political aims. From the very beginning he had shown to the conquered peoples a tolerance which was not only promoted by generosity but upon political wisdom. He had not attempted to apply an artificial scheme to all countries, but had permitted each country to retain its national institutions. One general principle indeed he did adopt, the division of power, and this was a notable improvement on the Persian method. Under the Persian kingdom, a satrap was usually sole governor, controlling not only the civil administration, but the treasury and the troops. Alexander in most cases committed the internal administration to the governor, and appointed with him, and independent of his authority, a financial officer and military commander. This division of authority was a security against rebellion. We have already seen in Egypt and Babylonia that in matters of religion Alexander was, like all Greeks, broad-minded and tolerant. But the Macedonian king, the commander-in-chief of the Greek confederates, had set forth as a champion of Greeks against mere barbarians, as a leader of Europeans against effeminate Asiatics, as representative of a higher folk against beings lower in the human chain. All the Macedonians and Greeks who followed him regarded the East as a world to be plundered and rifled by their higher intelligence and courage, and considered the Orientals as inferior, set by nature to be their own slaves. Slaves by nature they showed to the political wisdom by Aristotle himself, Alexander's teacher, and the victories of Issus and Gaugamela were calculated to confirm the Europeans in their sense of unmeasured superiority. But as Alexander advanced, his view expanded, and he rose to a loftier conception of his own position and his relation to Asia. He began to transcend the familiar distinction of Greek and barbarian, and to see that, for all the truth it contained, it was not the last word that could be said. He formed the notion of an empire, both European and Asiatic, in which the Asiatics should not be dominated by the European invaders, but Europeans and Asiatics alike should be ruled on an equality by a monarch indifferent to the distinction of Greek and barbarian, and looked upon as their own king by Persians as well as by Macedonians. The idea begins to show itself after the battle of Gaugamela. The Persian lords and satraps who submit are received with favor and confidence. Alexander learns to know and appreciate the fine qualities of the Iranian noblemen. Some of the eastern provinces are entrusted to Persian satraps, for example, Babylonian to Mizius, and the court of Alexander ceases to be purely European. With Oriental courtiers, the forms of an Oriental court are also gradually introduced. The Asiatics prostrate themselves before the Lord of Asia, and presently Alexander adopts the dress of a Persian king at court ceremonies. in order to appear less a foreigner in the eyes of his Eastern subjects. The idea which prompted this policy was new and bold, and it harmonized with the great work of Alexander, the breaking down of barriers between East and West. But it was accompanied by a certain imperious self-exaltation, which we do not find in the earlier part of Alexander's career, and it involved him in troubles with his own folk. The Macedonians strongly disapproved of their king's new path. They disliked the rival influence of the Asiatic nobles, and their prejudices were shocked at seeing Alexander occasionally assume Oriental robes. The Macedonian royalty was indeed inadequate for Alexander's imperial position, but it is unfortunate that he had no other model than the royalty of Persia, hedged round by forms which were so distasteful to the free spirit of Greece. The life of Alexander was spent in solving difficult problems, political and military, and none was harder than this: to create a kingship which should conciliate the prejudices of the East without offending the prejudices of the West. End of chapter 17, section 10, 11, and 12. Chapter 18, Part 1 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 18, Part 1. The Conquest of the Far East. Section 1. Hyrcania, Aria, Bactria, Sogdiana. The murderers of Darius fled, Bessus to Bactria, Narbazanes to Hyrcania, and the direction of their flight determined the course of Alexander's advance. He could not pursue Bessus while there was an enemy behind him in the Caspian region, and therefore his first movement was to cross the Elburz chain of mountains which separate the South Caspian shores from Parthia, and subdue the lands of the Tapuri and Mardi. The Persian officers who had retreated into these regions submitted, and were received with favor. The life of Nabarzanes was spared. The Greek mercenaries who had found refuge in the Tapurian mountains capitulated. All who had entered the Persian service before the Synedrian of Corinth had pledged Greece to the cause of Macedon were released. The rest were compelled to serve in the Macedonian army for the same pay which they had received from Darius. The importance of the well-wooded southern coast of the Caspian was understood by Alexander, and he sent orders to Parmenio to go forth from Ecbatana and take possession of the Cadusian territory on the southwestern side of the sea. He himself could not tarry. Having rested a fortnight at Zadracarta and held athletic games, he marched eastward to Susa, a town in the north of Aria, and was met there by Stadabarzanes, governor of Aria, who had made his submission and was confirmed in his satrapy. Here the news arrived that Bessus had assumed the style of great king with the name of Artaxerxes, and was wearing his turban erect. Alexander started at once on the road to Bactria. His way would have lain by Merv. In the wilds of Central Asia, the beaten ways of traffic remain the same for thousands of years. But he had not gone far when he was overtaken by the news that Stadabarzanes had revolted behind him. There was nothing to be done but to return and to secure the province of Aria. But this province did not stand alone. It would certainly be upheld in its hostility by the neighboring countries of Arachosia and Drangiana, which formed the satrapy of Barzyntes, one of the murderers of Darius. Hurrying back in forced marches with a part of his army, Alexander appeared before Artocoana, the capital of Aria. In 2 days Stadabarzanes galloped away to seek Bessus in Bactria, and his troops who fled to the mountains were pursued and overcome. There was no further resistance, and the conqueror marched southward to Drangiana. His road could hardly be doubtful, the road which leads by Herat into Seistan, and it is probable that Herat is the site of the city which Alexander founded to be capital and stronghold of the new province, Alexandria of the Arians. The submission of Drangiana was made without a blow. The satrap who had fled to the Indians was given up by them and put to death. At Prophthazia, the capital of the Drangian land, there befell a tragedy, whereof we know too little to judge the right and the wrongs of the case. It came to Alexander's ears that Philotas, the son of Parmenio, was conspiring against his life. The king called an assembly of the Macedonians, and stated the charges against the general. Philotas admitted that he had known of a plot to murder Alexander, and had said nothing about it, but this was only one of the charges against him. The Macedonians, although many of them were ill content with the developments of their king's policy in the east, found Philotas guilty, and he was pierced by their javelins. The son dead, it seemed dangerous to let the father live, whether he was involved or not in the treasonable designs of Philotas. A messenger was dispatched with all speed to Media, bearing commands to some of the captains of Parmenio's army to put the old general to death. If the guilt of Philotas was assured, and we have no reason to doubt it, we can hardly, so far as Philotas is concerned, blame Alexander for his rigorous measures, which it might have been painful for him to adopt. A crime which might be pardoned in Macedonia could not be dealt gently with in a camp in distant lands, where not only success but safety depended on loyalty and discipline. But the death of Parmenio was an arbitrary act of precaution against merely suspected disloyalty. There seemed to have been no proofs against him, and there was certainly no trial. In the meantime Alexander had changed his plans. Instead of retracing his steps and following the route to Bactria, which he had originally intended to take, he resolved to fetch a circle, and marching through Afghanistan, subduing it as he went, he would cross the Hindu Kush mountains, and descend on the plain of the Oxus from the east. First he advanced southwards to secure Seistan and the northwestern regions of Baluchistan, then known as Gedrosia. The Ariaspi, a peaceful and friendly people whom the Greeks called benefactors, dwelt in the south of Seistan. Alexander passed part of the winter among them, and gratified them by a small increase of territory, and made them free, subject to no satrap. The neighbouring Gedrosians volunteered their submission, and a Gedrosian satrapy was constituted with its capital at Pura. When spring came, Alexander pushed northeastward up the valley of the Haumand to Kandahar, and in pronouncing the name of Kandahar, we are perhaps pronouncing the name of the great conqueror, for the chief city which he founded in Aricosia was probably on the site of Kandahar, which seems to be a corruption of its name, Alexandria. The way led over the mountains past Ghazni into the valley of the upper waters of the Kabul River, and Alexander came to the foot of the high range of the Hindu Kush. The whole massive complex of mountains which diverge from the roof of the world, dividing southern from central, eastern from western Asia, the Pamirs, the Hindu Kush, and the Himalayas, were grouped by the Greeks under the general name of Caucasus. But the Hindu Kush was distinguished by the special name of Peloponnesus, while Himalayas were called the Imaus. At the foot of the Hindu Kush he spent the winter, and founded another Alexandria to secure the region, somewhere to the north of Kabul. It was distinguished as Alexandria of the Caucasus. While he was in these parts he learned that Saribarzanes was still abroad in Aria, inflaming a rebellion. Some forces were sent to crush him. A battle was fought, and Saribarzanes was killed. The crossing of the Caucasus, undertaken in the early spring, was an achievement which, for the difficulties overcome and the hardship of the cold and want endured, seemed to have fallen little short of Hannibal's passage of the Alps. The soldiers had to content themselves with raw meat and the herb of Silphion as a substitute for bread. At length they reached Drapsaka, high up on the northern slope, the frontier fortress of Bactria. Having rested his way-worn army, Alexander went down by the stronghold of Aornus into the plain, and marched through a poor country to Bactra, the chief city of the land, which has preserved its old site, but has changed its name to Bauk. The pretender, Bessus Artaxerxes, had stripped and wasted eastern Bactria up to the foot of the mountains, for the purpose of checking the progress of the invading army, but he fled across the Oxus when Alexander drew near, and his native cavalry deserted him. No man withstood the conqueror, and another province was added without a blow to the Macedonian empire. Alexander lost no time in pursuing the fugitive into Sogdiana. This is a country which lies between the streams of the Oxus and the Jaxartes. It was called Sogdiana from the river Sogd, which flows through the land, and, passing near the cities of Samarcand and Bukhara, loses itself in the sands of the desert before it approaches the waters of the Oxus. Bessus had burnt his boats, and when Alexander, after a weary march of 2 or 3 days through the hot desert, arrived at the banks of the Oxus, he was forced to transport his army by the primitive vehicle of skins, which the natives of Central Asia then used and still use today. Alexander's soldiers, however, instead of inflating the sheepskins with air, stuffed them with rushes. They crossed the river at Kiliph, where its banks contract to the width of about 2/3 of a mile, and advanced on the road to Maracanda, the chief city of the country, easily recognized as Samarcand. Bessus had no support north of the Oxus. He had some Sogdian allies, at the head of whom were Spitamenes and Datafernes, but these men had no intention of sacrificing their country to the cause of the pretender. Thinking that Alexander's only object was to capture Bessus, and that he would then withdraw from Sogdiana and fix the Oxus as the northern boundary of his dominion, they sent a message to him offering the surrender of the usurper. The king sent Ptolemy, son of Lagus, with 6,000 men to secure Bessus, who was then found in a walled village, deserted by his Sogdian friends. By Alexander's orders he was placed, naked and fettered, on the right side of the road by which the army was marching. Alexander halted as he passed the captive, and asked him why he had seized and murdered Darius, his king and benefactor. Bessus replied that he had acted in concert with other Persian nobles, in the hope of winning the conqueror's favor. He was scourged and sent to Bactra to await his doom. But Alexander did not arrest his march. He had made up his mind to annex Sogdiana. Not the Oxus, but the Jaxartes was to be the northern limit of his empire. The children of the Waste called this river the Tanais. It was said that the Greeks were deceived into imagining that it was the same river as the familiar Tanais which discharges its waters into the Maeotic Lake, and hence regarded it as the boundary between Asia and Europe, and thought that the herdsmen of the north who dwelt beyond it were the Scythians of Europe. But they can hardly have fallen into this error, for they imagined that the Caspian was a gulf of the ocean, and the two errors are inconsistent. Having seized and garrisoned Samarcand, the army pushed on northeastward by the unalterable road which nature has marked out, and occupied 7 strongholds which the Sogdians had built as defenses against invaders from the north. The road reached the Jaxartes, where that river issues from the chilly vale of Fergana, and deflects its course to flow through the steppes. It was a point of the highest importance, for Fergana forms the vestibule of the great gate of communication between southwestern Asia and China, the pass over the Tian Shan mountains, which descends on the other side into the land of Kashgar. Here Alexander, with strategic insight, resolved to fix the limit of his empire, and on the banks of the river he founded a new city, which is known as Alexandria the Ultimate. There is no doubt about the situation. It is the later Khulgend. The conqueror, judging from the ease with which he had come and conquered Arachosia and Bactria, seems not to have conceived that it might be otherwise beyond the Oxus. But the chiefs of Sogdiana were not as the Persian grandees. They were ready to dare greatly for their freedom against the European invader. As he was designing his new city, Alexander received the news that the land was up in arms behind him. Spitamenes was the leader of the movement, and it was supported by Oxyartes and other leading Sogdians. The few Macedonian soldiers left in the 7 strongholds had been overpowered, and the garrison of Samarcand was besieged in the citadel. A message had gone forth into the western wastes, and the Massagetae and other Scythian tribes were flocking to drive out the intruder. It was a dangerous moment for Alexander. He first returned to recover the fortresses, and in 2 days he had taken and burned 5 of them. Chiropolis, the largest and strongest, caused more trouble, but Alexander with a few companions contrived to creep under the wall by the bed of a dry stream, and threw open a gate to the troops. The resistance of the inhabitants was furious, and the king was wounded in the melee. The fall of Hierapolis was followed by the capitulation of the seventh town, and the remnant of the indwellers of all these places were led in chains to take part in peopling the new Alexandria. The next task should have been the relief of Samarcand, but Alexander found himself confronted by a new danger, and could send only a few thousand troops to succor the besieged garrison. The herdsmen of the north were pouring down to the banks of the Jaxartes, ready to cross the stream and harass the Macedonians in the rear. It was impossible to move until they had been repelled and the passage of the river secured. The walls of Alexandria were hastily constructed of unburnt clay, and the place made fit for habitation in the short space of 20 days. Meanwhile the northern bank was lined by the noisy and jeering hordes of the barbarians, and Alexander determined to cross the river. The offerings were not favorable. They betoken, said the seer, personal danger to the king, but Alexander would be mocked no longer. Bringing up his missile engines to the shore, he dismayed the shepherds, who, when stones and darts began to fall among them from such a distance, and unhorsed one of their champions, retreated some distance from the bank. The army seized the moment to cross. The Scythians were routed, and Alexander, at the head of his cavalry, pursued them far into the steppes. Parched by the intense summer heat, the king was tempted to drink of the foul water of the desert, and he fell dangerously ill. Thus was the presage of his offerings fulfilled. Luckily, Alexander soon recovered, for ill tidings came from the south. When the relieving force approached Maracanda, Spitamenes had fled westward to the town of Sogdiana, which probably answers to Buchara. The Macedonians marched after him, hoping to drive him utterly out of the land, but they were indiscreet, and the whole detachment was cut off. Learning of this disaster, Alexander hurried to Samarcand with cavalry and light troops, covering the distance, it is said, in 3 days, a forced march of between 50 and 60 miles a day, which seems almost impossible for foot soldiers, however lightly equipped, in the heat of a Sogdian summer. At his coming, Spitamenes, who had returned to the siege of Samarcand, again darted westward, and Alexander followed in pursuit. Visiting the spot where the unlucky corps had been cut down on the banks of the Sogd, the king buried the dead. Then, crossing the river, he pursued the fugitive chieftain and his Scythian allies to the limits of the waste. He swept on to Sogdiana, ravaging the land, and marching southwestward to the Oxus, he crossed into western Bactria and spent the winter at Zariaspa. The Bactrian cities of Zariaspa and Bactra bore somewhat the same relation to one another as the Sogdian cities of Maracanda and Sogdiana. At Zariaspa, Bessus was formally tried for the murder of Darius, and was condemned to have his nose and ears cut off, and to be taken to Ecbatana to die on the cross. The Greeks, like ourselves, regarded mutilation as a barbarous punishment, and it is not pleasant to find Alexander violating this sentiment. But the adoption of Oriental punishments in dealing with Orientals must be judged along with the adoption of other Oriental customs. Every conqueror of an alien race finds himself in a grave embarrassment. Is he to offend his ideals and fall away from his convictions by acquiescing in outlandish usages antagonistic to his own? Or is he, stiff-necked and inflexibly true to his principles of his own civilization, to remain out of touch with his new subjects? Is he to adopt the policy which will be most effective in administering the conquered land, or is he to impose a policy which works and is approved of in his home country, but may be useless or fatal elsewhere? Alexander did not adopt the second method. It was the task of his life to spread Greek civilization in the East, but he saw that this could not be done by an outsider, a general of Hellas, or a Basileus of Macedonia. He must meet the Orientals on their own ground. He must become their king in their own way. The surest means of planting Hellenism in their midst was to begin by taking account sympathetically of their prejudices. Alexander therefore assumed the state of great king, surrounded himself with Eastern forms of pomp, exacted self-abasement in his presence from Oriental subjects, and adopted the maxim that the king's person was divine. He was the successor of Darius, and he regarded the murder of that monarch as a crime touching himself, insomuch as it was a crime against royalty. It was therefore an act of deliberate policy that he punished the kingslayer in Eastern fashion, as an impressive example to his Eastern subjects. The misfortune was that Alexander's assumption of oriental state, and the favor which he showed to the Persians, was highly unpopular with the Macedonians. It was hard always to preserve a double face, one for his companions, the other for his Persian ministers. Nor was it Alexander's policy to maintain this difference forever. He hoped ultimately to secure uniformity in the relations of Macedonians and Persians to their common king. Meanwhile, in the intervals of rest between military operations, discontent smoldered among the Macedonians. Though they were attached to their king, and proud of the conquests which they had helped him to achieve, they felt that he was no longer the same to them as when he had led them to victory at the Granicus. His exultation over obscene Orientals had changed him, and the execution of his trusted general Parmenio was felt to be significant of the change. These feelings of discontent accidentally found a mouthpiece about this time. Rebellious movements in Sogdiana brought Alexander over the Oxus again before the winter was over, and he spent some time at Samarcand. One of the most unfortunate consequences of the long protracted sojourn in the regions of the Oxus was the increase of drunkenness in the army. The excessively dry atmosphere in summer produces an intolerable and frequent thirst, and it was inevitable that the Macedonians should slake it by wine, the strong wine of the country, if they would not sicken themselves by the brackish springs of the desert or the noisome water of the towns. Alexander's potations became deep and habitual from this time forth. One night in the fortress of Samarcand the carouse lasted far into the night. Greek men of letters who accompanied the army sang the praises of Alexander, exalting him above the Dioscuri, whose feast he was celebrating on this day. Clitus, his foster brother, flushed with wine, suddenly sprang up to denounce the blasphemy, and once he had begun, the current of his feelings swept him on into a denunciation and disparagement of Alexander. It was to the Macedonians, he said, to men like Parmenio and Philotas, that Alexander owed his victories. He himself had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus. These were the two sharpest stings, and they stirred Alexander's blood to fury. He started to his feet and called in Macedonian for his hypastus. None obeyed his drunken orders. Ptolemy and the other banqueters forced Clitus out of the hall, while others tried to restrain the king. But presently Clitus made his way back, and shouted from the doorway some insulting verses of Euripides, signifying that the army does the work and the general reaps the glory. The king leapt up, snatched a spear from the hand of a guardsman, and rushed upon his foster brother. Drunk though he was, the aim was sure. Clitus sunk dead to the ground. An agony of remorse followed. For 3 days the murderer lay in his tent, without sleep or food, cursing himself as the assassin of his friends. The army sympathized with his grief. They tried the dead man, and resolved that he had been justly slain. The tragedy was attributed to the anger of Dionysus, because the day was his festival, and the Dioscuri had been celebrated instead. The tragic issue of this miserable drunken brawl is a lurid spot in Alexander's life, but it was a slight matter compared to the act which is said to have marked his invasion of Sogdiana. When we saw him first cross the Oxus in pursuit of Bessus, we did not pause to witness his treatment of a remarkable town which lay on his way. The Bracidae, who had charge of the temple and oracle of Apollo, 20 miles from Miletus, are charged with having betrayed the treasures of the sanctuary. Their lives were not safe from the anger of the Milesians, and Xerxes transported them into Central Asia, where no Greek vengeance could pursue them. They were established in Sogdiana, not far from the place where Alexander crossed, a solitary little settlement, which, though severed so long from Hellas, preserved its Greek religion and Greek customs, and had not forgotten the Greek speech. It is easy to imagine what excitement was stirred there by the coming of a Greek army. The folk came forth joyously to bid Alexander welcome, and to offer him their fealty. But Alexander remembered only one thing. The ancestors of this people had committed a heinous crime against Apollo, and had sided with Persia against Greece. That crime had never been forgotten by the men of Miletus, and the king called upon the Milesians in his army to pronounce sentence upon the Branchidai. The Milesians could not agree, and Alexander himself decided the fate of the town. Having surrounded it with a cordon of soldiers, he caused all the inhabitants to be massacred, and the place to be utterly demolished. Few of the children of the children's children of the original transgressors could still have been alive. Many of the victims belonged to the 5th degree of descent. We cannot imagine a fouler enforcement of the savage principle that the crimes of the fathers should be visited to distant generations. It is small wonder that Ptolemy and Aristobulus, if the story is true, omitted it from their records of the campaigns of their king. There are other deeds of Alexander which cannot be excused, but there is none so black, none so cruel as the murder of the Branchidai, none for which some extenuating circumstances cannot be urged. There were more hostilities in western Bactria and western Sogdiana, until at last, overawed by Alexander's success, the Scythians, in order to win his favor, slew Spitamenes. With this chieftain the resistance expired. It only remained to reduce the rugged southeastern regions of Sogdiana, which were called Paratychini. The Sogdian rock, which commands the pass into these regions, was occupied by Oxyartes, and a band of Macedonian soldiers captured it by an audacious night climb. Among the captives was Roxanne, the daughter of Oxyartes, and the love of Alexander, who had always been indifferent to women, was attracted by the beauty and the manners of the Sogdian maiden. It was characteristic of him that, notwithstanding the adverse comment which such a condescension would excite among the proud Macedonians, he resolved to make her his wife, and on his return to Bactria, after subjugating other fortresses in Paratychini, he divided a loaf of bread with his bride according to the fashion of the country, and celebrated the nuptials. There was policy in his marriage as well as inclination. It was symbolic of the union of Asia and Europe, of the breaking down of the barrier between barbarian and Hellene, and of Alexander's position as an Oriental king. About this time an attempt seems to have been made to render uniform the court ceremonial. The Persian nobles were not well pleased that, whereas they were compelled to abase themselves to the ground before the divinity of the king, the Macedonians and Greeks were excused from the obeisance. Most of the Greeks would have been pliant enough, but there was one prominent man of letters who stood against the usage and drew upon himself displeasure by the utterance of bold truths. This was Callisthenes, a nephew of Aristotle. He was composing a history of the campaigns of Alexander, whose exploits he ungrudgingly lauded. He had joined the army, he used to say, to make him famous, not to win fame himself. It is related that Hephaestion and a number of others arranged a plan for surprising the king's guests at a banquet into making the obeisance. Alexander, raising his golden cup, drank to each guest in order, first to some of those who were privy to the plan. Each arose and prostrated himself, and was then kissed by the king. Callisthenes, when his turn came, drained the cup and went to receive the kiss without doing the obeisance. Alexander would not kiss him, and he turned away, saying, "I go the poorer by a kiss." Incidents of this kind created a coolness between the king and his historian. One of the duties of Callisthenes and the other philosophers and literary men who accompanied Alexander's progress was to educate the pages, the noble Macedonian youths who attended on the king's person, and over some of these Callisthenes had great influence. One day, at a boar hunt, a page named Hermolaus committed the indiscretion of forestalling the king in slaying the beast, and for this breach of etiquette he was flogged and deprived of his horse. Smarting under the dishonor, Hermolaus plotted with some of his comrades to slay Alexander in his sleep. But on the appointed night Alexander sat up carousing till dawn, and on the next day the plot was betrayed. The conspirators were arrested and put to death by the sentence of the whole army. Callisthenes was also handfasted on the charge of being an accomplice, and was afterwards hanged. Hermolaus was indeed one of his warmest admirers, but it is not clear what the evidence against the historian was. On the one hand, Ptolemy and Aristobulus asserted independently that the pages declared under torture that the Callisthenes had incited them. On the other hand, Alexander is said to have stated in a letter that the torture had failed to elicit the name of any accomplice. The deeper cause may be that Alexander suspected Callisthenes as an agent of the anti-Macedonian party in Greece. Before the end of summer, Alexander bade farewell to Bactria and set forth to the conquest of India. 3 years had passed since the death of Darius, 3 unique years in the annals of the world. In that time the Western conqueror, disarranging the cycles of Asiatic history, had subdued Afghanistan and cast his yoke over the herdsmen of the north as far as the river Jaxartes. He was the first and last Western conqueror of Afghanistan. He was the first but not the last invader. He was the first European invader and conqueror of the regions beyond the Oxus, anticipating by more than 2,000 years the conquests which had been achieved by a European power within the memory of the present generation. His next enterprise forestalled our own conquest of northwestern India. But England made her conquests from the south, Russia hers from the north. Alexander was the only European conqueror who marched straight from the west to the Indus and the Oxus. The Macedonian monarch's work in Bactria and Sogdiana was an unavoidable sequel of his succession to the Persian Empire. He had to set up a barrier against the unsettled races of the Waste, who were a perpetual menace to the civilizations of the south. He founded a number of settlements in these regions, not only for the purpose of military garrisons, but also probably with the hope of gradually training the herdsmen to more settled ways of life. If so, it was a vain hope. History has shown that there was only one means of forcing the shepherd races to become reluctant tillers of the soil, not until they have been encompassed on all sides by civilization and driven within a narrow geographical area, while they adopt, under the stress of necessity, the regular and laborious life of agriculture. The iron pressure of Russia's embrace is gradually narrowing the grounds of the nomads in Central Asia. In the days of Alexander they had endless space behind them and an indefinite future before them. End of chapter 18, part 1.